to start and being here at 1 o'clock. This is really, yeah, it's really pretty awesome. Oh, it's raining, that's why. And people didn't go too far, is that it?
So Jim, may I go first?
Sure, go ahead, Adam.
Thanks. Hi. Oh, that's not. Hi, I'm Adam Roach. I am now the area director for this working group. I just wanted to stand up, say hello, in case my face is new to any of you. Your faces are mostly new to me, so I suspect you probably don't know me. But if you ever want to talk about anything, find me in the hallway. I'm happy to chat.
Okay, it's 1 o'clock local time here in Chicago. I guess we'll get started. This is the Registration Protocols Extensions Working Group. And we have several participants in MeetEcho remotely. I'm not sure who in Jabber is remote versus in the room. I'm not looking at this point. But just a general reminder, when you're a MeetEcho person, we do have a few people who are going to be standing up to give summaries and presentations. Be sure to stand up in the pink box, which is all the way over there in that corner. Otherwise, please do remember to stand up at a microphone to talk and announce who you are. This is the Note Well, which everyone should have seen and should know about. I'm Jim Galvin, co-chair with Antoine Verschuren, who's actually in MeetEcho and participating remotely with us. And we have Alexander Marhoff, who will be our minutes scribe, taking a summary of notes for us. And Stepane Bortsmeyer is going to be our Jabber scribe over here. So thanks to both of them for taking that job on. Just a couple of standard slides, which we always have in the beginning here, just a general reminder to people. You know, the IETF in many working groups, not just this one, is always looking for people to review documents. You know, and of course we have that issue ourselves, people who are authors of documents. You know, please do, you know, take time to review documents. And keep in mind, if you're a document author, you know, when there are documents that you care about, one way to, you know, have leverage on people to review your document is to have gone and reviewed theirs. Turnabout is fair play, I guess. This is the agenda. We're on slide 4 for those who might be flipping the slides up themselves remotely. Which then gives me an opportunity to say, if you downloaded meeting materials, I do apologize. I was putting the chair slides up today, this morning. I actually did that several times here this morning. You'll know you have the most recent slides if you've downloaded them yourself and you're a remote person. If your slides have page numbers on them, the last deck that I put up had page numbers on it and the prior ones didn't. So that's one way to know if you did get the most recent ones. This is just the documents that we did in our working session. We're going to talk more about that in a bit. But we had 2 sessions at this meeting, and that seemed to work out pretty well. It was a working session. We had authors of editors of documents, and we walked through the 7 documents that you see up there, and we'll be hearing about that as we get into this, our second session. So this is me taking up the first 5 minutes of welcome and introductions. We have our Jabber Note Scribe, and so let's jump to our existing document status. We have had 2 documents published since the last meeting. Yay for us. The registration data, the EPP and RDAP status mapping document, and of course the key relay mapping document. And there's another note up there about whether a document is ready for last call or not. I was advised a little bit ago that that document should actually have been past last call, that it is already approved for publication, and what we're really looking for is a document shepherd. And so there is no need for another last call. I don't know if anyone wants to agree or disagree with that point. But I'm going to go forward with the advice that I was given here in a heads up towards starting the meeting. And so we're just looking for a document shepherd to help move that along. I think that being a document shepherd is a good thing for a new person who wants to come in. It's a good way to get involved and directly engaged with sort of the process and understanding a document. One of you have two principal responsibilities. One is you have to write the summary about the document so that it can be handed off to the ISG area director. And then you also have to track any comments. It's all built into the system, but you have to be paying attention when ISG members comment on a document. You just have to make sure that the document author, editor follows through and addresses the comments and deals with it, making sure that things are brought back to the working group if they need to be. So it's really just kind of a process thing, but it gives you a good insight into how things work and what's going on. All right, awesome. I thought, yeah. We were talking about that before the meeting started. We thought we had a document shepherd. We couldn't remember who, so. Awesome. All right, so there we go. So that's all set to go, so we'll be able to move forward with that. Yep, duly noted. And he's done it before, but we'll have plenty of documents here coming up, I think, for new document shepherds. We shouldn't depend on, one person to do all these things. So please do think about doing this. Okay. Jumping ahead, we have the third item on our 9-item agenda here is to a discussion of the working group session that we had on Monday. So we have up here a list. So I guess, Scott, you're going to be up first if you want to walk your way up there to the pink box, and we'll take a few minutes to go through everybody. Scott does he wants to quickly go through the slides that he did use on Monday. The folks who did go through documents were not obligated to prepare slides for this. So we're just looking for people to give a quick summary of the status of their document. I'm actually looking for two things. One is whatever summary you want to give about the discussion doesn't necessarily have to be details, just that you feel like you addressed all the issues. Were there any new issues that came up? And then that brings me to the second thing that we really want to know is what are the next steps for the document? Are you going to rev it and then last call? Are there open questions that still have to be answered that have to be taken to the list? Okay, so just a quick summary of what happened and then what you think the next step is. That's what we need most. But Scott, you're up first, and just say next and I'll move the slides for you.
Okay, thank you, Jim. I'm Scott Hollenbeck, author or co-author of the 3 documents that I'll be sharing some summary information for here in a moment. First thing I'd like to note, though, these are not working group documents currently. Okay, they're all individual submissions. They were all written originally to address or fill what I believe are to be functional gaps in RDAP. Some of these are specifications that are tackling some topics that, when we were going through the working group process earlier, we deliberately decided to punt on. So you'll find that in some cases there is already some form of this functionality in the core RFCs, but the operational environment in which I work, which is a domain name registry operator, needs a little bit more. So we wrote these documents in an attempt to fill those gaps, and we started with them as individual submissions. We did some implementation work to demonstrate the viability of the concepts, and we're now talking about this in the context of working group work to see if there's interest in working group adoption. Okay, so first of the 3. Short form, regex RDAP OpenID 02. Core RDAP includes client authentication using only the basic features that are included in HTTP. And I say basic, I didn't mean I just overloaded that term. Either basic authentication or digest authentication. And if you want to simplify that, we're talking about usernames and passwords. And if you've ever logged into a website where you're prompted for a username and a password, this is the type of client authentication that we're talking about. In the environment in which my employer works, that does not scale very well. We are looking at millions of potential users of an RDAP service, and we do not have the infrastructure in place to set up end-using consumers with user IDs and passwords. So we were looking at something that is similar to the single sign-on type of service that you might be familiar with if you've ever logged onto a website, a non-Facebook website, for example, using your Facebook credentials. Okay, in this particular case, the technology that we are proposing to use with RDAP is based on something called OpenID Connect. It's not an IETF protocol. Okay, it's actually being developed by an industry consortium. But OpenID Connect is itself based on OAuth. All right, and if you're familiar with OAuth, well, we do have an OAuth working group here. So I would certainly recommend you spend some time over there to get a handle on what's happening, okay? But OAuth is about authorization. It's not about identification, all right? And that's one of the gaps that OpenID Connect attempts to fill, all right? So if you look at the approach that we're taking here is that instead of relying on like a web server operator having to issue usernames and passwords, we have this notion of identity providers. And in the software implementation that we've stood up, an identity provider could be someone like Google, who is issuing identifiers for Gmail use. We also support Hotmail credentials. And we've made some arrangements to work with some, what we're describing as specialized providers. In this case, we've supported an identity provider developed by CZNIC. We've also stood up an identity provider of our own at VeriSign, to demonstrate the viability of some of these concepts. But the idea is that you get a credential from one of these providers, and it doesn't have to look like an email address, but it turns out that many of them do. And during the authentication process, you provide your credential. You are redirected via an HTTP redirect to a service operated by the identity provider, where you provide your password basically, and you have the opportunity to provide some information about yourself that will be shared with the server operator, or in OAuth terms, these are known as relying parties. And assuming all that works, the RDAP server operator gets a token that contains all of the information needed to identify and authenticate the end user. It gets information that the end user has decided to release to the server operator, and that could include information such as the purpose of the query, or any other information that the end user decides to release. And then based on that information, the server operator can make an access control decision. What is that particular end user authorized to see, and what type of information should I return in response to a query? Okay, so in terms of open topics, as you might imagine, this one has an awful lot of ongoing policy work that's attached to it. There's nothing in RDAP that says anything about who is authorized to see what. In fact, the assumption is that everything is available to everybody. But there's an awful lot of conversation happening in the real world about how that fits with changes in data privacy law, just changes in the operating environment. And that policy work, as long as it's ongoing, probably means that we cannot produce a final proposed standard version of this until we have a better sense of what people think are appropriate query purposes and any other types of parameters that might be needed to make access control decisions. The other open topic is based on the fact that OpenID Connect is very browser-centric. When you look at how the redirect works, there is an assumption there that you are redirected to something that is supported by a web browser. Well, that doesn't work really well if your RDAP client is something like wget or curl. Okay, so we have a bit of a hack in the spec right now that still unfortunately requires a web browser, but this is an ongoing topic of conversation. So a quick poll of the room when we were doing this on Monday was that there was support from a couple of people who are interested in implementation, and given that there's some implementation support, I'm thinking that I would eventually like to bring this document to the working group for consideration. Don't know if we're quite there yet though. As I said, given the ongoing policy work, I might want to let this one bake a little bit longer. Okay? Next. RDAP object tag 01. If you're familiar with the RDAP bootstrapping spec, you will find text in there that very explicitly states that we do not support bootstrapping for entity queries, right? And that's because entities, as defined in RDAP, they're somewhat free form, and they don't have a structure that naturally lends itself to identification of a server operator, unlike domain names, where you have some structure such as a top-level domain that can be directly associated with a server operator. And if you look at the way the bootstrapping document is written, we have a registry that says, here are certain types of top-level domains, here are the server operators for those top-level domains, and so if you are a client, you happen to see a domain name, here's how you can get a URL that identifies the server operator. Okay, so as I said though, you can't do this for entities. And as it turns out, the RIRs have been actually tagging entities for a number of years. I happened to find out in a conversation with Andy Newton that if you look at an entity issued by Aaron, it's typically of a form text something dash Aaron. Okay, so just for conversation, this document adopts a very similar type of approach. We aren't using a dash. We're currently suggesting that maybe there's some type of a separator that looks like an @ sign. At least one person on Monday said, no, I don't think I like the @ sign very much. But to cut right to the chase, this one too indicated, it looked like there was some support for the concept. Some ongoing discussion to be had. We'll take those conversations to the mailing list. And this document is one that I think is just about ready for possible adoption by the working group. And so post this meeting, I will send a note to the mailing list after I have a chance to edit it based on Monday's conversation, asking that the working group consider it for adoption. Okay. Next. Okay, now this one I'm a co-author. The main author is one of my co-workers, a fellow named Andy Fregley, who's here at the IETF for the first time. So welcome, Andy and Swapnil. Thank you. Core RDAP includes very limited search functionality. In fact, as the author of that particular spec, I will readily admit that what we put in there is very much a hack. It uses an asterisk character to do what looks like suffix pattern matching. And for all practical purposes, I don't think it's really useful. During the course of some conversations a year or so ago, when the folks at ICANN at GDD were talking about publishing an operational profile for RDAP that included other forms of search, my thought was, well, I'd like to get out in front of that and see if we can't do even better. So if we have to, add search capabilities to RDAP, how can we potentially knock out the need to do things like Boolean operators and whatever else we might want to do? And since most of us here have had an opportunity to write code at some point in the past, when you have to do pattern matching using a tool like grep or something, what do you use? You use regular expressions, right? So we took an approach, or I took a whack at seeing if we couldn't identify a method of using regular expressions to implement searching in RDAP. And that's what this specification does. It adds a new query parameter. So if you wanted to do a non-core search, we have a search type parameter with a value of a regex. The document identifies the path segments to do this type of searching. And we are currently suggesting using base64 URL encoding for the regular expressions. They're not URL safe, as you might imagine. There are certain characters in regular expressions that browsers or servers are not going to work and play well with. One of the suggestions that came up on Monday was exploration of hex encoding. This isn't something we forgot about. As we were thinking about it early on, we thought that there might still be some implementations of either browsers or servers who misinterpreted characters in hex encoding for characters in regular expressions, or vice versa. So one of the actions we took from Monday was to explore how much of a problem our perception really was. Okay. Beyond that, there were no other known topics. This document does have an IPR disclosure attached to it, and if you want to see what the details are, the URL is right there. When we asked about possible interest in implementation, there was none. And if anyone in the room maybe thinks a little bit differently, I'd say please come and talk to me afterwards, because given the lack of interest in implementation, this is not a document that I'm currently ready to request that the working group pick up. All right, so that's the summary. Any questions?
So I have one, Jim Galvin, but if you're not going to submit it to the working group just because there's no other implementations, and that makes perfect sense to me, are you going to submit it for registration in the IANA registry, or are you just going to hold on to it and leave it here for a little while?
When you say IANA registry of what?
For the extensions?
No, not yet.
Okay.
Okay, I think we're going to continue to pursue this one as a possible, as an individual submission, maybe for AD sponsorship or individual submission stream in the future.
Okay, thanks.
Andy Newton. The OpenID draft, you said one of the blockers is more policy work. We could all grow old and die before that ends, right? So what exactly do you mean by that?
I mean, I don't yet have a good answer for it yet. And so rather than saying unambiguously, yes, I want to bring it to the working group, I want to maybe just wait a little bit longer, Andy. And one of the reasons is if you look at the document right now, it has a section in there where it describes a list of query purposes. I don't know if that's the right list yet. That list came out of a document produced by an ICANN expert working group on GTLD registration services. And you know, we could debate within this working group if that is an accurate or good set of query purposes. But what I'm worried about is that if we bring this to the working group now and we define such a list, that it may not be consistent with whatever pops out of ICANN later. So one possibility could be that we find a way to ensure that we can either modify, you know, or amend or subtract from that list in the future. And I'd want to make sure that any other capabilities that the policy development work specifies can be added.
Okay, well, I think that's a good idea. What I would be fearful of is some sort of deadlock situation where the policy people are saying they can't do their stuff because there's no standard, and we're saying we can't do our stuff because there's no policy work. Yeah,
I'm really not too worried about us not producing a standard before they get around to actually needing one. Okay. Nothing else? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Oh, there is another slide there about implementations, but okay. So next up is Roger. Tell us about the EPP fees.
Good afternoon, Roger Carney. Monday's session was actually a very productive session. I thought we had solved a few things, but after posting to the list, it looks like we solved one thing, and got some great conversation going on list about a few other topics. So probably the one big thing was we did solve some complexity issues in the check command on this, and we're going to make it a lot simpler. A couple of the big open items are, I'm not going to say this name, non-standard fees availability check. So if someone is using or looking for availability check and does not pass in the fee extension, and it is a non-standard domain, there was discussion on if that should return unavailable, even though it is technically available. And the general consensus so far has been if a non-standard domain name check is issued with no fee extension, it will return unavailable. So those that aren't catching on to the naming that is premium names, if it's truly available still in the system, but no fee extension was passed for it, it's still going to return unavailable. And that's the general consensus from the mailing list so far. So questions?
Do you want to take a moment to just motivate why that's a good thing to do?
Yeah, so I think that probably the biggest one, and again, I'm not sure that I had thought about this until it was brought up. So if a registrar is not participating in non-standard pricing sales, with this option, they don't have to change anything. If we made it so that it was available, said it was available, then they would have to do some logic to be able to handle that response and still not do a non-standard sale. Because there are a lot of registrars that aren't going to sell anything besides standard price domains. So.
Okay, so what I was looking for, maybe I'll just state differently what I wanted was, sure. I mean, the fundamental problem here is just that you want registrars, a registrar and a registry to agree on the price before the create comes through. You know, you just don't want that to be a surprise on either side for the registrar to suddenly be charged too much money or, you know, that kind of thing, because it's a surprise all around and affects the registrant, and it's just a bad thing. So this is about providing a more appropriate user experience. And if there are no questions, oh, go ahead, please.
Unfortunately, I didn't have a chance to, oh, sorry, Cal Fire, Newster. I didn't have a chance to respond on the list yet, but my concern with that approach, specifically the approach of returning unavailable is that it effectively makes those servers non-backwards compatible to the current implementations. So in order to be compliant with this RFC, you would have to now have a different behavior for a command that has that is not using that RFC. So you're effectively harming potentially some registrars that have not implemented this at their end. So we might want to consider how we make this backwards compatible with existing implementations that are out there and existing registrar implementations.
Thanks, Cal.
Alex Mayo from Micto.it. Cal, what you say is essentially even that is depending on the implementation, because what we did, for example, before we had a fee extension, all those names were reserved technically, so they were unavailable. So actually when we started the fee extension, we removed them from the reservation list and put them onto the premium names list. So in terms of backwards compatibility, for us, the backwards compatibility would be to still return unavailable. So I think it's for each of those things, people are doing it differently. And that's a problem, yeah.
So my thought on that, though, is that it's when they're reserved, they were never available for sale. So that was the correct response. If they are available for sale, if they're not reserved, and that is the behavior of the server today, then to be compliant in the future, you will now have to change that behavior. Whereas in your case, to be compliant, if you wanted to reserve your names, you could. So there's no issue for backwards compatibility in your situation because you could reserve them or you could make them available, and a registrar would have the same behavior.
I'm trying to take this to another level, and the discussion that we just had shows that we need to be very careful about like creating ambiguity in the draft, because each and every ambiguity essentially creates a fork in a path of registries. Yeah, and so when we change the behavior, maybe like in 2 years again, we are back to the discussion which of the two options would be the backwards compatible option. So that's why I'm very frequently insisting that we try to make it specific rather than adding yet another option that creates yet another fork in the registry implementation decision tree, let me put it that way.
This is Jim Gould from VeriSign. So I'm a little bit less concerned about the backward compatibility since this new draft would have a different namespace. So if you want to support the old draft, you can continue to do so, but the new one would be perfectly clear, and you would support a new namespace, not having to maintain backward compatibility.
Okay, anything else? Nothing in Meet Echo? All right, thank you, Roger. And James, you're up next.
Yeah, so what we talked about was the reseller drafts that are currently in the working group. We started out by defining the purpose for providing reseller information at all. We also covered the RDDS copy authoritative data anti-pattern. And what that is an authoritative party, the registrar providing data they're authoritative for, to a party that's not authoritative, which would be the registry, for the sole purpose of displaying it in RDDS, RDAP, or who it is. And then what we did was we discussed the two options that were presented on the list. One being supporting a reseller object and linking that reseller object to provisioning objects. And that's what the current draft support. The second object was a more generic organization object that would have an extensible set of roles where one of the roles could be reseller. When we were talking about the goal, GoDaddy, I don't want to call you out, but I am. So GoDaddy, the only registrar in the session, really did not see value in the registry having visibility into the resellers. So this really opens up a question that I hope other registrars that would participate on the list to be able to state whether or not they see value in having the registries have visibility into the resellers. And we presented various features that the registry could provide. I think the most important one is reporting. So it's kind of a call out to the list for those registrars to speak up. And then it comes down to, well, we need to support a mechanism for providing reseller information to meet what's currently in the RDAP profile. So the consensus of the group was that they really didn't see much value in just providing the reseller information for the sole purpose of displaying it. So the question is who's going to implement this? We don't want to do an academic exercise with this. So one of the goals was to see whether or not there's more value beyond just displaying it. And then what we did was we talked about the more generic organization. And unfortunately, Scott Hollenbeck was in the other group, so therefore he couldn't weigh in. He was an advocate for it. Actually, also Anton as well, he was remote, and he couldn't really effectively participate. So I think it would be good to hear from them as well, and those on the list related to identifying concrete use cases where a generic organization may be useful. I think one of the items that came up was a privacy proxy that could be used in the future, but it would be good if we had concrete examples of reworking these drafts to meet a more flexible approach with organization, whether it is a feature now that is needed or in the future. So the issue is that we really don't have good direction on the existing drafts because in essence, we know that we need to move forward to be able to meet the RDAP profile, but there's a question of value. And then there's a question of whether or not we should support a more generic organization. So my proposal is this, is to continue with the drafts as they are. I don't think they're ready for last call by any stretch of the imagination. Look to the list for those registrars with resellers to speak up. And then those that are advocates for the more generic organization to speak up on the list and provide those concrete use cases. And that's it.
Okay, thank you. Any questions, comments? Okay, one coming to the mic.
Scott Hollenbeck here. Indeed, I think we should take this to the list, but I've got one concrete suggestion. The best way to consider alternatives is for the proponents of an alternative to write an internet draft describing the alternative. So, given that Antoine and I have both, kind of jumped on the idea that maybe a generic organizational object would be a viable alternative, I'll take up taking on a conversation with Antoine to see if he and I or others might be interested in crafting a proposal.
This is Ulrich Schwisser, IS. As I said in the last meeting, I still haven't seen any use case for the reseller object. We don't have a use case for registrar object. We don't have one. So what makes a reseller so much more important than a registrar? Why would we need all the organizational information of a reseller if we don't collect the organizational information of the registrar?
Well, I'll just say that we do collect the registrar information. It's just provisioned in a different manner. Yeah. There's no API to set that information. It's, like I said, it's collected and stored, at least at the registry level. The case of the reseller is that we have no visibility at the registry level of what the reseller is. So one option presented was, well, why don't you just put a string on the domain name to say what the reseller is? But the issue there is that it's just an extra attribute that gets displayed up in RDAP. So if there was the concept of an object that was linked by ID, then you could change the information like the name or whatever it is, like what we do for hosts, right? The point is that it is a real object in the real world, and that you're modeling the real world as opposed to just latching on an attribute to domain name for the sole purpose of displaying it in RDAP. So as far as, that's what I'm saying is that it would be great to hear from the registrars on whether or not it makes sense, for example, for registries to be able to group reports based on a reseller. I don't know.
Andy Newton. So when you say excuse me for not fully understanding this problem here. When you say you need this for the RDAP profile, you're talking about the ICANN RDAP profile? All right. I don't know if it's still applicable or not because ICANN has made some adjustments to that. So you might want to go back and review that. So, or
for ICANN
Francisco
to
can
speak to
help
that
us.
one.
Oh, sorry, Francisco Arias. So I think it's not for the RDAP profile why you will need the reseller name. This is for a policy that was published in January. It's the consistent label and display policy that has the reseller name as an optional field. I think that's the reason why you will need not necessarily this, but something like this.
So, okay, I want to make a comment too. I didn't get ahead of the queue on you on there. So Jim Galvin, my view about this, I mean, I hear the hesitation and comments about whether we need this or not, but you know, my view about this is more a case of this is the way to do it if you're going to have it. Not that this is in any way mandatory or required by anyone. And that's just, you know, as the technical body that creates these things, we're just simply specifying this is how you would do it, because there are, you know, a couple of different policy discussions going on the other side in ICANN as to whether or not one is going to do these or needs to do them or has to do them and under what circumstances. And separate from that is whether or not a registrar would even want to give you the data. But those are all policy discussions. They have in another forum. This is all just about this is how you do it if you're going to do it. And from my point of view, I think that makes it relevant, and it's important for that standard to be available and accessible for registries, at least in the GTLD community. Thanks. And Alexander, you look like you were going to make a comment.
I just wanted to point out, as Francisco said correctly, in the consistent labeling and display, it's an optional field. So even from the policy perspective, there's no need to think about creating an EPP extension. So there is no pressure for implementing that.
Well, could I inject in that?
Sure you can. But I agree that we could think about a mechanism to actually do it if we would be in the position that we would need to do it. Yeah.
Right. So the concept of optional. So if a registrar wanted to provide it, right? If a registry, we had talked about whether or not one registry wanted a competitive advantage over another. Not that I'm saying reseller is a big advantage. Just to be clear on this. But you would need the mechanism by which to do it. As Jim pointed out, is that if you're going to do it based on the policies, then this would be an approach to do it.
It's Federico from the .br. Besides the fact that perhaps we only have vision from registrars that actually have customer services here, but we know that there are some registrars out there that their sole business is to provide services to resellers, and they don't have customer services. And for those, I'm quite sure this extension would be useful. Because registries that currently have tick quizzes don't have a way to inform people that are querying the registration services where they can find actually support, basically.
Okay, not seeing anyone in MeetEcho, no one else in the room standing. Oh, coming to the mic, go ahead.
Hi, this is Niels Tenuver. Great that this work is going forward, but what I've been missing in the draft, and this is a point I made in the last meeting as well, and this is true for this draft, but also for others, that it would be great to see the privacy considerations guidelines applied to this and to have a bit of an understanding of the potential implications there, because I think there could be a significant amount of them, and there doesn't seem to be a lot of thinking going into this, or at least it's not reflected in the draft on the list, and I think the draft would be hugely improved if that would be added, so that would be great.
Well, could you help contribute that?
Well, I think I'd be very happy to work with you on that, so we could do that.
Sure. Okay.
Okay, thank you. Anything else? Not missing anyone? Okay. So these documents they're still just a work in progress. We're just going to keep them out there for right now. Okay, thanks. And last but not least, Jacques and the DNS operator document.
Jim, this is Roger. We kind of missed the last step on my draft, I guess. As Jim was describing that, we're not looking for last call on the fee document. There is a new revision coming soon, within the week probably, detailing the changes that we agreed to here and whatever's going on in the list. So I just want to make that clear since you asked for it and I forgot to say it. So.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I actually, you're right. I should have said it too. It's a work in progress document. So that's what's important. Thank you, though.
Jacques Lato with CIRA. So quick overview. This draft is about enabling the DNS operator to update the DS record to a registry in a trusted manner without involving the registrant. That means the DNS operator can tell the registry or they tell somebody that they want the DS uploaded in the zone for that domain. And today, the registry can perform this function of listening to a DNS operator, a registrar, or a reseller, are all potential actors in this string to receive, to perform this action. So based on the discussion on Monday, one thing that came clear is the DNS operator doesn't update the registry directly. All they do is flag an entity, either the registrar, the registry, or the reseller, to go look for a CDS record in a zone and create a DS and update the zone. So this is important. So they don't update, they flag an API, and that API performs the action of looking for a CDS and creating a DS. So in the session Monday, we talked about the draft and during the workshop or whatever we call it. And the outcome of that is Jaromir is going to update the RDAP part to figure out what's the registrar API or what's the way to access that in RDAP to access the API. And during the session, we had a lot of updates, a lot of discussion around the CDS itself. And I think it's not clear, but if a zone publishes a CDS record, that signifies the intent of the zone operator to have its CDS in the parent. So if there's an API out there to facilitate this, it's to make it faster, but the API is not there to show the intent of the DS to be in the zone. When you publish a CDS, you mean it signifies to the parent you want the DS in the zone. So the API is there as a mechanism to facilitate that. Instead of polling all the zones that you have under control as a registrar, they tell the DNS operator tell you, this zone, I'd like the CDS to be uploaded, and the agent grabs it and puts it in the registry. Right now in the document, there's some things we need to fix. It talks about the registrar all over the document. And in the beginning, we have a definition that the registrar can be a registrar or a registry or a reseller. So we need to find a new term for that role, the actor that's doing the actor that runs the API. We need to have a new term for that. I'm not sure what to call it. Gandhi, they use I think they call it the registrar function extension. It's a thing that listens for the DNS operator to perform action. So I'm not sure what the name is. At CIRA, we call it DSAP, which is DS Automated Provisioning. So it's an API, and it looks for the CDS, creates a DS. So soon we'll publish V4 with a couple of these updates to make it clearer, and Jaromir's update, and then we'll be looking for feedback on that. So it's moving along.
Okay, any questions or comments? Just having to look over my shoulders to see if you're coming to the microphone is becoming annoying. Go ahead, Sylvain. It just works.
Okay, relaying Antoine Verschoven. The API is perfect for DS maintenance, but not for bootstrapping, since there is no secure channel for doing that besides EPP. So what is the EPP AirDAP connection in this draft?
The RDAP is to tell the DNS operator where to go to use the API. And in the API, there's a mechanism to bootstrap a domain. And like we said, and I keep saying, the preferred method to bootstrap a domain with DNSSEC is to go through your standard method, or just through the registrant, goes to registrar, they go through their interface, EPP in. When that mechanism doesn't exist for a certain domain, or if a registrar doesn't support that mechanism, then the DNS operator can use this method to bootstrap domains. And there's a bunch of mechanism in there that you want to ensure the CDS and all the name servers are the same over TCP. You can use challenge cookies. There's a bunch of ways to make sure the bootstrap is secure. But the most secure way is through the standard channel. But this is when the DNS operator can't use the standard method. It provides an alternate method.
Okay, anything else? All right, please, go ahead, Jody.
Jody Conker, GoDaddy. Just curious, so if the registrar hasn't implemented DNSSEC, then there's no way for the DNS operator to get their records onto that domain, is that right?
Today, yeah.
Okay.
So if the registrar doesn't support DNSSEC, there's no way to get the DS in the zone.
Does this protocol then allow you to do that? Allow
Yes.
the DNS operator to do
It
that?
would allow DNS operator to, well, in that case, the registrar or the registry could run that thing, the DS automated provisioning, and they could listen for requests from a DNS operator that under that registrar to submit a DS.
But the registrar would still have to implement this. There's still something that the registrar has to implement.
It depends. It can be, there's a policy that we need to define eventually, but this can be run by the registrar. That function could be run by the registrar, or it could be run by the registry. So CCTLD could run this for all of its registrar if they don't want to do anything with the NSA.
All right.
So, but typically, if under a registrar, they sign the domain, that means that the registrar is not the DNS operator for that domain. That would be the way that, so if you're the registrar and somebody else, you delegate a domain, they sign their domain, and they can't give the registrar the key, the DS, then using that interface enables them to bootstrap their domain.
So then are the keys or the DNS keys passed back to the registrar somehow?
There's a poll message.
But just, Jim, to add a comment to that, Jody, I mean, but the issue, of course, is if the registrar doesn't support DNSSEC, none of that makes any sense.
Yeah, like, you're not going to keep the keys, right?
I wouldn't think so.
Okay, next.
Yeah, so I was just going to add.
And you are?
To that. Sorry, Matt Poundset, one of the authors on the draft. So this would provide the technical capability for that, but whether or not you could actually do it depends on what gets implemented by the registry and by the registrar. So while this provides the capability for if the registry wants, and if it's a registry that's let's say contractually able to do this, the registry can run this itself and completely bypass the registrar. Or in situations where that's not permitted, the expectation is that the registrar or reseller would run this and pass the information up to the registry through EPP or whatever mechanism they're using. So this is a thing that provides the technical capability, but whether it's actually possible to do this by going around the registrar depends entirely on what registry you're in, what registrar you're using, what their agreements are with each other. That's completely a policy question.
So just to add, internally within the registry, we're planning to add a feature where for a registrar, we would not be able to use this feature. So none of the domain could be updated with this for certain registrars, if they want to keep control of the DNSSEC.
Okay. Any other comments or questions? I'm not seeing anything. All right, so thank you. We're actually running a little bit behind schedule here, but just very quickly here. So the last 4 documents that are currently working group documents are all still works in progress moving forward, but we had some good progress and advancement on the documents here in the working session. So I'm expecting that we'll get revised documents on each of them in the not too distant future. And just quickly again, Scott, so for your documents, OpenOID, you're going to be holding back as an individual document for the moment. So no REB at the moment. You're not submitting it to the working group. The RDAP object tag, you do expect you will probably in the not too distant future be asking the working group about that one. And the search regex is also going to stay as an individual draft at the moment. Okay. All right, thank you. And moving on, so now we have some new documents to look at and think about. So James, you are up next, and I will run your slides for you. And the usual kind of thing, you need to end with you know, what question you're asking of the working group here for all of these things as we get through them.
Yeah, so I'm just up here to introduce this draft that was recently posted. And its goal is to be able to support bulk operations at the registry level, and it's defining a file format to support that. So next, please. So what this draft contains is a file format that's called the dataset file, or DSF file format. That if you're familiar with the data escrow draft that's out there, where you have a definition, and in this case, CSV data, it files pretty much exactly the same thing. So if you know that, you'll probably know this pretty well, except for the fact that this is contained within a single file, kind of like the SMD or a PEM. But it also supports providing the input for a bulk operation as well as the output or the result of the bulk operation. So the input file will include the metadata about the operation itself, the format of the data, and also the data within a single file. The result will include the result metadata along with the format of the result data itself and the data. As far as an example, we at VeriSign have a requirement to provide a bulk mechanism for the thick transition of ComNet and jobs, and we're using this draft as a mechanism to be able to support that mechanism. Next, please. All right, so the approach is pretty much the file contains a header. The header contains one key type element that defines the type of the bulk operation. The convention is a data notation with object, operation, and description. Just to note that the draft doesn't require that currently, but that's up for discussion. But an example is the 2 files that we're going to be supporting for the bulk mechanism is domain.update.contacts to be able to bulk update domains with the contact references, as well as contact.create.routing. And the reason, just to note, about the routing is the fact that we can envision being able to bulk submit contacts across multiple TLDs. So therefore, there would be a routing element to specify which TLD to create this contact in. There is a definition of the fields. If you know the data escrow draft and the CSV format, that's using XML schema definitions, which are simple types. There's also support for an is required flag to specify whether or not the value is required in the data. And then there's metadata about the file, specifically a DSF identifier, which allows for the client to be able to get that mirrored back in the result. There is data in the body in CSV format following the definition in the header. And the field definitions in the draft is sort of long because it's supporting all the various objects, domain, pose, contact, and I borrowed that from the data escrow. And it's extensible to support multiple objects and additional fields. And I've created a first extension to support the .job specific fields that need to be able to be provided for bulk create within .jobs. This is the ABNF for the file format. It has a header, it has a body, it has a begin separator followed by the data, and then the end separator. Next, please. probably best to show an example. It might be hard in the back of the room there, but on the left column is XML with defining the format and the metadata about the bulk operation. And then it has like the client, the DSF identifier there. And then on the right, it's in the same file. You have the separator and the data that meets the format. Next, please. And then the next slide shows the result file. So the result file will provide back the overall result for processing the whole file. It provides the format of the data within the result file, and then it mirrors the client identifier, and it includes the server transaction identifier, along with metadata about the processing. How many records were processed, how many were successful, and how many failed. And then the data has by object, using the primary key of the objects, the results for each one. And if you notice, the codes are very much like EPP, thanks Scott, so you reuse that as well. Next, please. So I'm not asking for the working group to take on this document as of yet. I'm really interested of whether or not other registries are interested in supporting a consistent mechanism for providing bulk operations. And I'm really interested in what registrars' feedback are, because since we're required to do the bulk mechanism, it would be great if we knew if what we're doing makes sense. So I'm looking for reviewers and feedback. One of the items is defining DSF types. As I noted, the mechanism, I had the dotted notation, whether or not that makes sense, whether or not there's a need for subtypes, also whether or not those types need to be registered, like an I in a registry. So therefore, if different registries supported this, that they would be able to specify the types and the formats associated with those types. And then one of the other questions was associated with, does it make much sense for the client to pass the definition to the server if the server already knows what those definitions are based on the type? So like, for example, a domain.update.context, we know on the server side that we're expecting a domain name and 4 contact fields. So one option there is that the server can preload the definitions and then key off a particular type. So that's an open topic for discussion. But one thing right now that we're implementing is a web UI to support our bulk mechanism that would allow for registrars to directly submit these. So one of the questions is, does it make sense for the registrars to provide the whole file with the definition of the data where this spec does not define the protocol? It defines a file format. So in the case of a web UI, there's another mechanism by which the client can specify the type, can specify the identifier, or any other metadata that would be included in the header. And as far as the format, the server is already defining what the format is. So in the case of the web UI, the registrar may be able to just provide the data, right? And the same thing would hold for other kinds of protocols as well, like REST. If you wanted to find something that allowed for the client to provide that data without having it be within the whole file. But in the end, the server is generating this file. It's taking the input in whatever mechanism is used to generate the file and then produce a consistent result file. So that's it. Any questions?
Questions or comments? Alexander?
Do I understand correctly that this file is not to be passed within an EPP channel?
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. Yes.
Okay, anything else? Okay, thank you, James. And next up is Andy coming up top. Thank you.
Can you, next slide. How do we do this? Are we virtual clicking? Right.
Yes.
So Marcus and I put together this draft on how to use RDAP for domain name availability, and it was kind of inspired by someone asking on the list, and it happens about every 6 months. Someone comes along and says, "How do you do this with RDAP?" And the answer is, "Well, we've never really defined it." So this is how we're thinking about the approach. It's very simple. There's no new JSON that gets defined. All we're doing is we're specifying 2 new query parameters that you can put on the end of a query. Because the RDAP spec says you're supposed to ignore parameters you've not seen before, it's completely backwards compatible. So next slide. Real simple. Do a query, pass in a query with the query on there, and if the domain is not available, you pass back 200 OK with the response. It can be a very short response. You don't need to put all the information that you would normally put in there. Next slide. Or if they can register, you just give them the simple result code, and that's it. You could put an entity body there if you want to, but it's not really necessary. Next. We did create a second query parameter because there is a use case where someone wants to know if a domain is available, and if not, they want the actual registration information that you would normally get. And so that's what the second query parameter does, is it basically says, let's do the check, but by the way, if it is registered, just give me all the information. And that prevents a second round trip to the database. That's what that's for. Next. Why? There are several TLDs already doing some sort of RESTful implementation. So we might as well try to come up with a standard way of doing it. It's really simple, and it's really easy to integrate into a browser. Next. When you think about it, for doing it the non-HTTP way, you would have to send the traffic through multiple different hops to get to the registry for this information, whereas a check over RDAP can go from the browser directly to the registry if it needs to. Next. Also, if you want to do bulk operations, you can take advantage of HTTP pipelining, or even the HTTP2 asynchronous multiplexing if you really wanted to. Though pipelining probably is sufficient for most needs. And that's it.
This is Jim Gold from VeriSign. I'm just going to mirror what I said on the list. I don't believe RDAP is the appropriate place for this. RDAP is there. It has registration data. But fundamentally, I see a different set of clients for this. I see name spinners. I see where there's a need to be able to do this in bulk and get very concise, quick answers to this. RDAP is an information service. DNS could be another place, but I don't think that is right either. So although it could be done in RDAP, I think it's the wrong place. I would prefer that maybe it could be REST. Maybe it could borrow some elements from RDAP to be able to support this, but separating it into something to meet the specific needs, I think is better.
Kalfa, Newstar, I'd like to echo Jim's opinion and just go a little bit further, that the RDAP service, it may not today, as people implement it, have the full availability logic that registries have when determining if a name is available or registerable, to be precise. And if we were to add that logic, you'd add a significant resource effort on pretty much every RDAP query. So I urge you to consider a different channel for determining availability.
So let me address that. There is nothing to say that you have to use the same RDAP server for your normal RDAP responses as you would for this, right? You're just reusing this protocol for that. If you really wanted to, and this was a concern of yours, and your architecture did not allow it, you could stand up a separate endpoint. Works just fine. There's no need to do that. The other thing is that there are registries out there that do have an architecture that can support this. There are use cases, and I will admit there are some use cases where going through something like EPP is a preferred route because the registrar or the reseller may have other opinions about availability. I think the fees discussion is a pretty good example of that. And in that case, you can't use this. But for cases where a browser can go directly to the registry, this is the simplest way of doing it.
This is Jim Gold from VeriSign again. I still want to point out the fact that there's a need to be able to do this not by one. Honestly, if you've looked at some of the name spinners out there, they don't go to DNS all the time. They cache them. They don't do that because it's one by one. In essence, if you really want to be able to support this, it needs to be in bulk and it needs to be lightweight. So,
yeah, you can do this in bulk.
Yeah, I see the pipeline thing, but it's still a one by one query. You could, it really doesn't scale to really a large amount of spinning.
I would disagree with that. I mean, there is a large community of people who understand HTTP and getting it to perform. And to say that you can't do that kind of goes against what most of us understand to be the modern internet. So yes, you could design a protocol that's slightly slimmer. You'll spend some time doing it. You may not get it right either. This is a very simple solution to that.
This is Jim Gould from Verisign again. I'm not saying can't. I will rephrase that. I'll say it's not appropriate. I think it'd be better and better suited if we define something that was specifically suited to meet this need, as opposed to extending something that wasn't engineered for this purpose.
Well, so I will actually, so in the WEIRD's working group, when we created RDAP, this topic did come up, and we, just like the regex and just like the authorization stuff, we punted on it. So this is us coming back around and saying, here's how to address it. We already have several registries that are doing some sort of RESTful domain check anyway. Might as well just have them do this simple thing. If you don't think it's appropriate, then I would like to know what you do think is appropriate as far as a RESTful interface. What features does this not have that you think it requires?
This is Jim Gould from Verisign again. My suggestion would be to support a many, not one by one. It could be REST, and there may be opinions here whether or not REST is even too heavyweight for this purpose, but even if we're a REST, an ability to be able to do it in bulk would be preferred.
It's Fred from the .br registry. I would like to add one feature that would be nice. It's to, if it's not available, besides the fact that you can send the current registration, you could perhaps send an attribute telling what other options are available, like suggestions.
Is that beyond domain variants?
Yeah, domain variants, or even other TLDs. Perhaps you have a set of second level TLDs to offer on the third level. You can offer in others the same name that are available.
Okay, yeah, so alternatives in other words. Okay.
So are you asking for working group adoption here for this document?
I would have to confer with my co-author because I didn't ask him that question. Actually what I mostly was looking for was feedback like what Fred just gave. So.
Okay, that's fine. And I mean, at this point, I would say we'd probably take it to the list anyway to ask for adoption. And I'm thinking that just the adoption discussion will get interesting because the document is so simple. If it's adopted, I just can't imagine jumping right to publication with it. There's not much going on, so we'll see. But okay, so up to you on the next steps. So thank you. And that brings us to the escrow documents and Gustavo. So let me get your slides up.
Hi, hello. Gustavo Icahn. So in the ITF 97, I introduced the working group to these documents. In the new utility program, there was the need for defining a way to transfer the objects from a registry to a third party, and this third party is called the data escrow agent. And the idea was, for example, if there is an emergency, that data escrow deposit could be released to an emergency operator, and that TLD could be restored in a matter of hours or days. We have found out that these drafts have been used not only for that specific purpose, but for example, right now, when there is a transition of the RSP, the registry service provider, so for example, there is a TLD and a different registry service provider is going to take over that TLD, well, registries are using this format to transfer the objects between different registry service providers. So it appears that this format is being used not only for the purpose that was intended, but for different purpose. And basically, what I would like the working group is to adopt these drafts, so we can spend more brain cycles on this and see if we can keep up with a better format in the future. So basically, what I'm asking the working group is for adoption of these two documents.
So before we get to the question of adoption, could you speak to the potential relationship between this document and James Gould's data file format bulk operation document?
So basically, it's using, I mean, in these documents, there are two ways of representing the objects. One way is XML and another way is CSV. So the CSV portion, it's, I think, basically the same as what James Gould is defining right now, but there is another way, which is the XML, which is being used by most of the registries, I think, on the new utility space. So that's the relationship.
Yeah, I'll jump in on that. So the main difference is the amount of data that's needs to be deposited. In the case of data escrow, you're providing like a whole dump of the registry database. So there are many files associated with the data escrow. So the header or the manifest will refer to many files, and each file has the format that's consistent with the mechanism that's used in the dataset file format document. So they're two different purposes, similar approaches, but different, I guess.
Well, and there is also another difference, right? In the escrow format, there is a way to provide differential deposits. So, and the differential deposit, it's basically what has changed between different periods of time. So you can have a huge full deposit of gigabytes, and then you can have a small differential deposit. That's the other difference there.
So, I mean, I mentioned that the two documents, since obviously, because if we choose to go forward and taking these on and even taking yours on, that'll be a question we have to ask. I mean, you don't want to give to the ISG two similar documents. We kind of have to be able to explain between them what the difference is.
They have just two completely different purposes. I mean, we can reuse REST or other approaches instead of having to reinvent it every time. So I think in this scenario, there shouldn't be much of an issue of reuse for two different purposes. So these data escrow drafts have been around for quite a while, and they're used very heavily. So I'm hoping that we're able to take these ones on.
Yeah, the first version was published in 2010, so they have been there for a while. And there's a mailing list, in the ITF, and we have received a lot of feedback. So these drafts, in reality, they contain a lot of feedback from the community already there.
So thank you for that. I just wanted to call out those two things and make sure everyone heard that here in the working group and was aware of the issue and the distinction. Let me speak to the issue of whether or not the working group here can take these on as working group documents. So I have spoken to our new area director about this. There are two things to observe. One is, strictly speaking, our charter is scoped to expressly limit our tasks to only EPP and RDAP extensions. And in that strict interpretation, these documents don't fall into that category. However, the second thing to bring up is the way in which I was discussing this with the area director about going forward with these things. Is it also turns out that there's no other logical place for these documents in the IETF. All of the expertise that would have anything to say about these documents is in this room and in this working group. I mean, you can try different paths, individual submission and things like that, but ultimately you're going to get the same set of people commenting on it. Nothing has changed, right, from what we talked about before?
Not really. I do want to add that, looking at this working group, and I'm coming in a little bit fresh, I see there are like 11 documents that are currently adopted, and I know that there are things that are moving forward based on the editor's draft and stuff. I would be kind of hesitant to amend the charter to take on additional work until some of those are off the plate, either pub rec or, just taken off the milestones altogether. I don't care how they get out, but just the pile is huge. And so it's just, I know that the stuff that you're working on right now is likely to come out pub rec pretty soon. So it's probably not a big issue, but just, I would like a bit of an interlock there.
So we're going to have a milestone discussion here coming up. So maybe we can sort all of that. Oh, except you have to leave soon. Well, I think maybe we'll get to that before you leave, unless you were looking to duck out now.
No, about 15 minutes from now.
Okay. So we'll come back to that. So the path forward, if we were to adopt it, when we ask that question, is part of that process would be that we would have to update the charter. And it would be okay for us to just submit a couple of sentences and ask to allow us to cover this particular topic. And we could work that process, and the area director will work with us to do that. And then we could formally take them on in terms of process and all of that. So I think what I'd like to do is two steps here at the moment. One is just get a sense of the room about whether or not people, believe that adopting this document is a sensible thing to do, or these documents. And then there's some process that has to go with that. And then the second thing is we're going to have a milestone discussion here in a little bit. And so we'll talk about what it means to prioritize the work and what all that is, to speak directly to Adam's issue. So I don't want to execute the adoption, but I just want to get a sense of the room about whether or not we should continue to do that and keep that in our minds here. Okay? All right. So, and as you did say, just so that people are clear on this, these are expired documents. They've been expired for a while, but they have also been around for a long time, and they are actually in use and being used by registry. So it's not like there's we're not really expecting any issues here. They should be able to jump fairly quickly to publication if that's going to happen. All right. So let me ask the question. I'm going to ask if, are all those in favor of adopting this document? Just ask for a hum so we can get a sense of the room. If you're in favor of it, to hum, and then I'll ask if you're not in favor to hum also. So all those in favor of adopting these documents in this working group? Okay, thank you. And all those opposed? Okay, I did hear a small hum there for not adopting them, but otherwise there seemed to be a fairly broad majority for doing that. Okay, so we'll just keep that in mind for the moment, not take any specific action. We'll come back and when we talk about milestones to see how we're gonna deal with these things. Okay, so thank you. Okay, and in fact, the next topic is the milestone review. So let's jump. I put two slides in here to describe our current milestones. These are the current milestones that the charter shows and the dates at which it says that these things would be done, which is all kind of interesting. And maybe I'll jump to the next slide and then I'll sort of talk through. This represents the current status of our documents. What I put in red there is an indication of the status of that particular document, whether it's working group last call, which actually the launch phase, it should say that it's ready for publication. But there's WIP is simply work in progress. And then there's a couple of expired drafts that are sitting in the background now, so they've kind of fallen into the background. The way that we have been, when we first created the charter, we had laid out a bunch of documents that were existing, that were out there that we were going to do, and we kind of laid out a priority order and a list in which we wanted to do them and created those dates. And we haven't done anything to manage those dates along the way. The way that we've been approaching our work is whatever anybody wanted to pick up and work on. So we've been kind of managing the order in which we do things based on whatever gets traction. Whatever people are interested in doing. And we have, in terms of operating the group, felt pretty comfortable about that. That's just the way to progress work. If that's what people want to do, then we'll let them work on that. Nonetheless, we also have clearly been operating somewhat slowly. So there are documents that are just sort of hanging there, waiting to be pulled to the front. In general, Antoine and I have tried to have the approach that only about 4 documents are actually active at any given point in time. This particular meeting is the first time we have changed that, because we did have those 7 documents in the working session. So we essentially had 7 documents as a work in progress. But prior to that, we always tried to not have more than 4 that were active in front of the group. What I had hoped to do for here, but I did not actually do, what I want to do, and what we will do on the mailing list, is I want to reorder these things and reorder some dates on them and change the milestones to sort of match where we are, push everything forward that we're not working on, and the things that we are working on, we're going to split them up into hopefully moving along here in the next 2 meetings, maybe 3 at most. Okay, and then everything that is not dated will simply move into next year. So we'll push all of those things forward a year, so they'll come after the fact. And that'll be the order in which we'll take them. To speak to the issue that Adam had raised the concern, he doesn't really want us taking on any new work. Obviously we have to honor whatever process is being put to us. So I think the way that I would like to turn that question to the working group is to consider, do we want to try to pull those, if we were to adopt them, where would we put them in the list? Would we adopt them because we want to do them right away, or adopt them because we're going to put them at the end? If we would adopt them and put them at the end, then obviously we'll just sort of take a step back and not do anything at the moment. But if we're going to adopt them and pull them up, then there's a discussion that we can have with our area director about whether or not he's okay with that, and we'll set up the milestones to reflect that, and if that's something that he can work with. So I want to have the discussion into those two choices. Adopt them and take them on now, or adopt them and push them to the end and get some comments from the reactions from the group. So Alexander, please.
We are Alexander Mayhofer from NIC2IT. We are a very small group, and I have chaired a very small group before. And my suggestion would be to have a third option, which is we only adopt something if we have enough people who actually agree that they would work on that. Yeah, it's very easy to adopt a working group document. You have seen that I've humped against adopting the escrow documents, not because I don't like the documents, but they are expired. We have other work to do, and we have a very small party of working people, I would say. So we have already a lot of on our table. Let's get done with some of what we have in the queue before getting on more work. That's because, as you have seen, we have done a lot of work on the fees extension this week. Yeah. And other documents in the RDEP space as well. But we have focused on very few documents and tried to do very intensive work on those, and it has, in my opinion, proven to be very successful. And by splitting out our work attention to 10 more documents, I'm not positive we are going to be done with any of them.
Okay, thank you. Scott?
Scott Hollenbeck, supporting what Alex just said, but I'd like to throw something else out there as well. If you haven't read it yet, take a look at RFC 7942. All right? It describes a section of text that can be added to documents that describes implementation status. All right? And while implementation is not a requirement for the development of a proposed standard, I've heard a number of people here, as we're talking today, talk about, yes, someone has implemented this, someone has implemented that. And as a document shepherd for something in someplace else, one of the questions the shepherd is asked is, please describe any implementations. Okay? Anyway, so I bring this up because as we are trying to consider which documents should have higher priority, I think knowing who has actually implemented it could be very helpful, right? And to close on that thought, I am not a fan of adopt and push to the back, because we've already got a very long list of documents here that we have implicitly pushed to the back through inactivity. And I would almost suggest that rather than keep them there, we ought to consider dropping some. If there's been no discussion, no progress, no implementation, they probably shouldn't be there.
Okay, thank you. Next.
Andy Newton. So it occurred to me as Scott was talking that some working groups have different methods of operating. Some really don't want discussion of drafts unless they've been adopted by the working group, and some don't care. And I'm actually not sure which model we follow in this working group. It's not really a high activity mailing list, so pretty much I think anything goes, right?
Generally, yes, just to speak to that. We do let people bring documents to the list to talk about. Part of the motivation for that, though, is the mailing list is also officially the point of discussion for things that are going to go on the IANA registry of EPP extensions. So they don't have to be working group documents, but this is a place that people can bring those documents that they just want to put there that are not going to go onto the standards track, and they can have discussions of it here. So you're right, we've kind of taken an open door policy to discussions on the list.
Yeah, and maybe we should make that a little more well known. That was kind of my point, if that's what it was. The other thing is, and getting to the extensions, which you just brought up. EPP has extensions, RDEP has extensions. The RDEP, like the draft I just presented today, there actually is no onus on me as the document author to actually to come talk to the IETF about that. The RDEP registry allows me to go to IANA and say, register this, and walk away, right? The benefit of coming here is to get feedback, like what I got from Fred. So maybe we should look at a way of kind of making a little more less ceremony around getting the extensions done. where people can formally present here and get feedback, but then maybe be encouraged just to go off and do it as a private extension if necessary, if that works for them.
Yeah, the question that an author of a document and extension has to ask themselves is, do they want it on the standards track or not? And if they want it on the standards track, then it does need to come into the working group. But other than that, you're right. There's no obligation to make it standards track. They can just choose to have discussion here and register it. And in the registry that was created for the EPP extensions is actually created with that rule set. That's a distinction that's drawn.
Yeah.
As long as you don't want a standards track document, just, stick it there.
Yeah, so maybe we should think about that a little harder.
Yeah, that's a good suggestion too. So
I was just going to add on, is RDAP different in that with EPP that goes into the IANA, there has to be a review first, right?
Yeah, so there is, Andy, there's expert review for the RDAP registries, and there are guidelines for the expert reviewers. We don't actually have a thing about we have to send it to the mailing list because actually our regex didn't exist at the time. There's nothing to stop the expert reviewers from forwarding it on though.
Yeah, it's Jim Gould from VeriSign. I kind of want to mirror what was discussed related to Scott in the implementation. Some of these drafts I'm the author on, and honestly, we have implemented some of them. We have not implemented all of them. And it may make sense is that if there is critical mass associated with or interest in a particular document to either put it higher on the priority list or move it off the list altogether. Because I'll just point out a couple of them here. One is the verification code and the NV mapping drafts. We're the only ones that have implemented this. My hope was that it would be a good generic solution. But right now we're the only ones. So at that point, those could be either moved to, at least the verification code could be moved to informational or pulled off the list altogether. The allocation token specifically was collaborative effort with Newstar and VeriSign. Newstar is implemented, VeriSign has not. I see uses for it, but we haven't really had a need to implement it as of yet. Change poll, we are actively starting to use that now, and my hope is that one I have the most hope on, honestly. I think that has a lot more generic use cases that multiple registries should be interested in. And then when it comes to something like the IDN table draft, that may have use in the future when you consider the IDN map extension. Those go together. So I'm not sure whether or not in the IATF, looking at, in this group in particular, there may be things that are built by a registry or a registrar wants to draft something that if there's not critical mass, maybe we look to move it down on the priority list or move it up.
Okay. Any other comments or suggestions? All right. So let me summarize in the following way and suggest the following 3 actions. First, specifically to Gustavo for your documents, you should rev them and revive them and add in that revision an implementation status. I think would be a good addition to those documents, and certainly that's a reason to rev them. So we should do that at least so that they become live again and they're there. I like the suggestion of revisiting the current list of extensions and reconsidering whether or not they need to be standards tracked. I think that's a really good question for the working group to speak to. So my second action is that Antoine and I will take on as an action to propose a new milestone ordering and grouping, okay, based on where we think we are now, and send that to the list. And then the third action is what I'd like to visit. And we may end up having to poke individuals who are authors of documents because we know how discussions go on our mailing list. But we will actually poke individual people to see, gee, do you still want to press on this being a standards track document or not? Since there doesn't seem to be a lot of traction, and maybe we'll end up getting some documents withdrawn before we update the milestones, and won't actually update them until after we've revised the list and decided. And then we'll see what our milestone list looks like and come back to the question once we're done with that, of whether or not to adopt these documents. Because then our area director will have an opportunity to see if we've, thinned the herd, so to speak, and he'll be, much more comfortable. And also, as part of the thinning, we may end up reprioritizing things, and so we'll know exactly where we want to put it. We'll see an implementation status, and I like what Scott said earlier. I mean, extensions that actually have traction, or documents that actually have traction certainly do feel much more valuable to move forward. And they ought to, get a priority just for that reason, if nothing else. So, but we can have that discussion and revisit that. I thought I saw a hand over here. Yeah, Alexander?
Just a brief question. As I said before, we are a small group. The documents that we do, they're like interesting to a very small part of the internet population. And we don't have to forget that we also need to become considerate with the resources of the higher forces that are beyond this working group, like the ISG and the RFC editors. They are busy with other stuff as well. And so I completely agree to what you have said, and I appreciate that we're trying to clean out our document list to the important points.
Okay, sounds good. That okay with you, Adam? All sound good?
Sounds like a good plan. Thank you very much.
All right, thank
I
you.
do have to duck out, though.
Yep, okay. So that was the milestones discussion, which we're now coming down to the end. So we have one other new topic here, postal info elements. So over to you, James.
Yeah, so this particular topic was discussed on the list, but I did not get a sense that there was any actual agreement on how to interpret the contact RFC for doing contact updates. So next slide, please. So I did some researching on this topic, and there were two postings on the list associated with postal info. The first from Santosh was, how do you, once there are both postal infos set, how do you delete one of them, right? So the relationship here is that the contact can have one or two postal infos, one with int and one with loc. The second posting was from Klaus, and it was associated with how do you remove the update the streets within the postal info. So if you had two streets set and you went in and did an update and only put one street, should it remove the second street that was there previously? So the open questions are how to remove postal info. The other one is, how do you change an int postal info to loc or vice versa? And does the update have replace semantics at the postal info level or at the sub elements of postal info? Okay, so next please. So just a little reminder here, and if you guys haven't looked at the spec for a little while, if you look at the contact change, the sub elements include postal info, voice, fax, email, auth info, and disclose. So one of the questions is, for each of these sub elements, is there replace semantics? So if they're included in the update, does that imply that it's going to replace all of the data for that entire element, right? And does the exclusion of an element imply a deletion? Okay, next slide, please. Okay, the issue with postal info is a little bit more complex because it's a 1-to-2 relationship from the contact. So is the postal info a replace of a set, or is it a replace of an instance of a postal info? So in this case, if you consider the int and the loc to be separate instances, and they are independent instances, then if you are going to delete one of them, you would do it explicitly by providing an empty element with the type, which would imply deleted, right? If you are going to replace it as a set, then the way you would delete it is by just specifying one of the types, and then it would implicitly delete the other one. So the other item is associated with how are the sub-elements, what are required when you're not deleting. So if you look at the XML schema in the RFC, all the elements are optional, right? The elements of postal info that are required in the create include the name, adder, although not in the XML schema, but in the text. I'm sorry, street, city, and country code. So my assumption is the fact that if you were to update that you would also require all the required elements that are in the create. Next. So I have a proposal. My proposal is that the sub-elements of the change do have replace semantics. So that means that if you were to receive an update with an element, you would first, on the server side, delete what's there for that element and then replace it with what's provided. The other thing is that the contact postal info are treated as independent instances. They're not a set. So if you were to exclude one of them, it does not implicitly delete the other one. And then lastly, to be able to delete or to switch them, what you would wind up doing is that you would use the empty postal info to delete. And that's it. Any thoughts, especially those that post on the list, to weigh in on this?
Alex, I vaguely remember turning my head around this like 8 years ago or something like that. And I think in that specific case, it would be very useful to have an overview of the procedures that various existing implementations actually apply. Yeah.
To do what? Say that again.
What does an actual implementation of a registry actually do in these cases? That would be useful. Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
because honestly, I actually don't know what we are doing. Yeah.
Well, I'll just tell you what we are doing. Is that we only support one of the postal types, not both. And we do not support replacing or exchanging out the type today. So that would mean that a new contact would have to get created. And then you have to replace all the references to that contact later. So that's why I really am interested to see what is the best way to do this. Because, you know, for ComNet, we're going to be going thick, and I would want to propose to our team to do it in the best way.
Alex Mayover again. Are you proposing that we do an update to the base EPP specification in that case, or a clarification, or a PCP, or?
No, this is already supported.
I'm sorry, already supported? Say that.
I'm saying that the schema, like for example, if you could not provide an empty postal info, that would require an update. But the RFC already supports doing this.
Yeah, but then this is a clarification. So, okay, yeah, because that's what he was asking. So it is something, it's an update, because it's a clarification about how to interpret.
And I'll leave that to Scott to answer.
Scott Hollenbeck, keep in mind, we are talking about RFC 5733, which is a full standard, right? The only process we have for updating such documents is via entry of erratum.
Or a standard track document that actually updates that document, isn't it?
At a lower level of the standards track, right? Bit of a sticky subject there. I don't have a good answer, but wait, just a little poke at Jim though. Did I hear you say that our implementation is not RFC compliant?
No, it is definitely RFC compliant.
No, but RFC compliant is you support both.
It says it doesn't say must.
I'm waiting for you to say it's a matter of registry policy.
Yes, it's absolutely registry policy. Thank you very much. Yeah. So anyway, yeah, just to know, I believe this is an interpretation issue. I'm not proposing modifying the RFC. I think if it supports what is being proposed here as defined.
Alex.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I mean, I take Scott's point about process, but I really think that, you know, I mean, this just seems to me to be important stuff. And we got to figure out what the right way is to say something about this. And I don't know offhand what the process is, but Francisco, please.
Yeah, so I don't know about the process either, but I think this may be important to clarify. In the context of the ETP space, there is common policy implementation related to transliteration of contact information. that may result. So I don't know what's the status with all the registries, but I understand very signed just because what was said that you're only using one type. I'm guessing that would be the
I don't know. No. We support one or the other, not both.
Oh, I see. Anyway, the point is with this translation policy, there may be cases in which registries may want to support having both for one specific registration.
Yes, but again, registry policy, so.
This is Ulrich. I think it's a good proposal. Just the last point, the delete. Usually we have the, contact delete for deleting things from contact objects.
Well, actually, I lost a bet with GoDaddy because how do you delete voice and fax, right? So the way that's done is with an empty element. So you're not deleting the contact itself. You're deleting or removing an attribute that was previously set.
You can't. No, I think what we have on the objects is we have attributes that we have always, and these we have change, and then we have like status that you would delete. That's not always there.
Well, you have add and remove. In the case of those,
and so we have the add and delete, or we have change. And change really is not a delete, because then what you have is an empty voice maybe. Or
let me cover one thing. The add and remove deals with lists, right? So you got statuses, you have I forget on the contact or the other add and remove. I think it's mainly statuses versus a many relationship. In this case, although postal info is 1 or 2, it's not n. So in that case, a change itself in any of these attributes, voice, fax, email, whatever it may be, is the question is whether or not it's a replace. And if the change is equivalent to a replace, then therefore providing an empty element would remove what is there.
Scott Hollenbeck. I can assure you that the intention of the author was that change means replace.
Are you sure about that, Scott?
Okay, so yeah, I guess it's here. You're asking for feedback and comments, and I guess you're asking the working group also to consider what's the next step in the process.
What I'm looking for is just an idea. Well, specifically more from the registries. What are they doing? Is there a best practice or an appropriate interpretation of the ROC to do it in a consistent way? Because then you're leaving the registrars out to hang here because they don't know. If the registries can't agree on this, how could the registrars possibly figure out how to do this?
Yeah, I admit I actually don't know for sure what we do on our side, so I'm interested to go back and look and respond and see how this compares to that. So maybe this is just a document under discussion on the mailing list for the moment.
Well, what I could do is post this as a proposal on the list, and then the registries could specifically respond back with whether or not there's an issue with this or whether or not they do it in a different way, and hopefully we can get to some best practice. I'm not going to suggest consensus policy or ROC updates or anything like that.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you. Not seeing any other comments or anything in Meet Echo. Okay. So that brings us to the end, and looking for any other business. And I actually have 2 items already to put under any other business. So first is just a quick discussion about feedback from our working session. I'll tell you what I've heard so far. 2 things. One was generally positive. I think that everyone felt that there was very good progress in the discussions that were held. So for the document authors, editors were able to bring issues, and we had a lot of good discussion. And I don't think anyone disagrees with that. So we made some real progress on all the documents that were talked about. I heard 2 things as potential comments, criticisms, if you will. One was just the logistics of, it being one room, which was not laid out in a way that was conducive to separate working groups. There's not much to do about that. We actually did ask for a room that had essentially, circular tables or some kind of separated setup, as opposed to the classroom style that we had. And we were told that that wasn't available. So, we did ask, we can see if we can get it. I think we managed to do okay even without that. So, we'll always ask for that in the future. And if we get it, then we'll work with it. If we don't, that's okay. The other comment was just that we had 2 tracks. Now, 2 tracks made sense this time. The documents broke apart nicely into RDAP and EPP. Of course, the downside is we have the usual problem of being a really small working group, and sometimes somebody wants to be on both sides. And, we did have a couple of issues with that. I guess, Scott, I'll just use you as an example, the most notable one, since he totally ran the RDAP session from top to bottom, but I think he really wanted to be part of a couple of the EPP discussions too. But he kind of missed out on that a little bit there. I don't have a good answer for that. I suspect that that'll be driven more by whatever documents are in progress at the time that we have the meeting. My current feeling about this is the positive side outweighs the negative side at the moment. I've actually talked to our area director already, and he's supportive of us asking for 2 slots again next time, so we can continue with this model. And have a working session. On the issue of whether or not we have 2 tracks, I think that'll just depend on what's in progress. I mean, if we have a lot of documents, having 2 tracks is helpful because you can get more done. But if we need to do them serially, then maybe we'll just have to compress the number of documents we're working on. Maybe that'll sort itself out as we go through the milestone exercise also. So anyway, that's what I've heard. That's my sort of opinion about what to do next from that, but I'm interested in any other comments. Anyone have anything else they want to add to that? So please go ahead.
I think it would have been more helpful to have them closer together, so that those that were here maybe for the first day or planning to go for the second day didn't have to be here for all that time, to get the most attendance. That's kind of what I'm suggesting.
So fair enough. I'll speak to that too. We did actually have them on Wednesday and Thursday, as anyone who is watching the agenda carefully will observe. And then there was a little bit of miscommunication that went on, but basically we were asked if we would swap for one of the sessions, and they were going to swap Thursday, and it was supposed to be Monday and Thursday. And I just, in the spirit of wanting to be agreeable with our area director, figured it was a pretty good thing to do because you like to be friendly with your area director. You never know when you might need that, those little bonus points, brownie points or whatever. But somehow in the background that got turned into, they swapped it for Wednesday instead. So we ended up with the furthest split apart meetings instead of close together. So that was an accident of circumstances. I think in general they'll keep them close together, and we'll certainly make a point of asking for it, and hopefully that'll happen. So whatever the days are, it'll just be 2 days in a row, or at most, like a Monday, Wednesday, or a Tuesday, Thursday. So someone can kind of just come for part of the meeting if that's really what they want to do.
Yeah, this is Roger Kearney. As one of the facilitators, I actually appreciated a day in between at least, because I was able to strike up quite a few conversations on some of the open items. So I thought it was pretty useful to not have them back to back, basically. So.
Okay, thank you. Keep that in mind. Anyone else? Anything? Not seeing anything in Meet Echo? Okay, then Scott, you're up, and if you just want to talk from your microphone there, save you a little walking time.
Sure, thank you, Jim. Scott Hollenbeck here. Those of you who've been following along for the last few years or so may have heard me or others describe registration operations workshops. We've held them in conjunction with ICANN meetings. We've held them in conjunction with IETF meetings. This time we're going to be holding a workshop in conjunction with the GDD Summit, and I'll let Francisco or Gustavo talk about that if you'd like. But the idea here is to try to get these things close to where the people who we want to participate will normally be hanging out for something else. The format is very similar to what we did with the working session on Monday. The idea is that we solicit proposals from people who want to talk about real operational working topics where you'd like to get together with like-minded people and describe what you're doing and get some feedback and maybe work out some issues. So anyway, 12 May 2017, Madrid, Spain. If you go to the website behind that URL, you'll find a registration form. There is no cost beyond your normal travel costs and all that fun stuff, but we don't charge you to participate. We are still open for interesting presentation topics if you have something. And so please take a peek, and if you want to bump into me, ask any more questions, I'll be here till sometime tomorrow afternoon.
Okay, thank you. And Francisco, you want to say something? Go ahead.
Francisco here. Since Scott mentioned it, there are 4 events that are happening back-to-back in the same hotel in Madrid. Starting on 9 May, we have the GTD Summit organized by ICANN, which is mainly focused on utility-related stuff. It's an operational business type of meeting. Usually utility registries and registrars attend that. Then as Scott mentioned, the next day on the 12th of May, there is the row. And then on the 13th, there is a one-day DNS symposium organized by ICANN, same hotel. So this is more of on the technical side. And then there is DNS OARC in the next 2 days on the 14th and 16th, also in the same hotel.
So if you're looking for 11 days of travel, go for it. Okay, thank you. And I guess I had one last any other business that I put here too, but let me just ask, is there anything else that anyone else wants to bring up about anything, any other business for the working group? Okay, so we actually do have, we have 10 minutes left. We had originally thought we might have an hour, then it got trimmed to half an hour, and we've now run 20 minutes over what we had thought we would have, so we really only have 10 minutes left. But we do have that 10 minutes, and I can adjourn the working group meeting, and we can go back to a working session if anybody is prepared to spend a little time talking about something in their document. Any document editor, author want to take this time to do something? No, I'm looking around, no one jumping to the microphone, no big hands. Everybody's tired, right? It's Thursday afternoon. Okay, yeah, we're getting ready for bits and bytes tonight, right? So, all right, well, then I would say the working group session is adjourned. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate everyone being here. And we have no other follow-on work, and so that takes care of it. We're all done. Oh, blue sheets, where are they? Did everyone sign them? Hold them up, please, if you have them, and hand them to someone who didn't get to sign them. Where's the other one? Anybody see it sitting around? There it is? Okay.
That's a good way to end
Basically, funny how